When Caleb walked into that dusty auction yard, he was just looking for 2 horses to save his failing ranch. He never imagined he'd walk away with a woman in chains, or that she'd be hiding a secret powerful enough to destroy them both. The place where they sold livestock sat at the town's edge like an old wound that refused to close. Dirt covered everything, the ground, the rickety wooden fences, even the air itself. Men gathered there, reeking of cigarette smoke and hard labor, their patience wearing thin under the afternoon heat. Dust floated so thick it choked the sunlight, making everything look sickly yellow. Caleb positioned himself near the back fence, keeping his hat low and his shoulders tense. The auctioneer's rhythmic chanting washed over him like an annoying tune stuck in his head. He hated being here. Auctions always left a bitter taste in his mouth. Ever since childhood, when he watched his father lose their cattle piece by piece to crushing debts. Hard work meant nothing to the creditors who came calling. But this winter had been merciless. 2 of his strongest horses had gone lame within days of each other. Without new animals, his ranch would collapse financially. So here he stood, fingertips brushing against the meager coins in his pocket, wondering how much hope a desperate man could purchase. The gates squealed open. 2 bay-colored horses trotted into the ring, driven by a handler's stick. They weren't beautiful animals, but they looked sturdy enough. Their legs appeared strong, their eyes remained clear, and their coats showed signs of neglect rather than disease. These were survivors, horses that could thrive if someone gave them proper care. Caleb watched them circle nervously, their ribs faintly showing beneath dull hides. The bidding began slowly. A few voices rose and fell. Men shook their heads, unimpressed. Someone complained about rising feed costs. Another joked that winter still had plenty of suffering left to deliver. Caleb waited, keeping his pulse steady, then lifted his hand. The auctioneer acknowledged him with a nod and called out the bid. Another man counted lazily, barely interested. Caleb raised his offer again. Then silence. The auctioneer squinted through the dusty air, searching the crowd for more bids. Nothing came. He grinned, a sharp, reckless expression that made Caleb's stomach tighten with unease. Sold. The gavel crashed down hard. Then, as if remembering an amusing afterthought, the auctioneer jerked his chin toward the far corner of the ring. And what the hell? Take the woman, too. For one frozen heartbeat, Caleb thought he'd misunderstood. Then laughter erupted around him, sudden and cruel. Men clapped and someone whistled. Beneath the noise, chains rattled softly, a thin metallic sound that sliced the heat like a knife blade. Caleb turned slowly. She stood several paces behind the horses, half concealed in their shadows. Rough, filthy rope bound her wrists together. What might have once been a dress now hung in torn, mud-stained layers. One sleeve was ripped almost completely off. Her boots showed deep cracks, the toes nearly worn through. Dark, tangled hair fell across her face as she stared downward at nothing. She didn't cry out or fight. She simply stood motionless, like someone who'd learned that movement only brought more pain. What's going on here? Caleb's voice sounded foreign to his own ears. The auctioneer shrugged carelessly. She came in with the livestock. No paperwork worth keeping. Doesn't talk. Can't work. She's worthless. A man leaning on the rail shouted. Tried using her in the kitchen. Useless as a broken tool. More laughter followed. Another voice added something vulgar. Someone spat into the dirt. Something hot and sharp twisted in Caleb's chest. He looked at the men surrounding him, at how casually they evaluated human flesh, as if it were grain or scrap metal. He thought about his mother, dead for years now, and how her hands always trembled when money ran scarce. He thought about how easily the world decided what people were worth. I didn't buy a woman, Caleb said firmly. The auctioneer tilted his head. Didn't charge you for her either. One of the horses stamped nervously, sensing the tension in the air. The woman flinched at the sound, her shoulders tightening, but she never raised her head. Caleb opened his mouth to refuse, to say he wanted nothing to do with the situation. Then he noticed another man standing 2 rails down, staring at the woman with a hunger that made Caleb's skin crawl. The man smiled when he saw Caleb hesitate, like a scavenger sensing dying prey. "Untie her," Caleb said. The laughter stumbled and broke into confused murmuring. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. "You sure about this, Cowboy?" Caleb held his gaze steadily. "I said untie her." For a moment, the auctioneer looked ready to argue. Then he waved an irritated hand, and a young worker stepped forward to cut the rope. The woman's hands dropped to her sides. She swayed slightly, unsteady on her feet, and reached out to grip the nearest horse's mane for support. Her fingers curled into it, as if it were the only solid thing in her entire world. Caleb handed over his coins and took the horse's reins. He didn't look back at the crowd as he led the animals from the ring. Whispers started again behind him, mocking, disbelieving. But he kept walking. She followed. He noticed it halfway down the road, the soft crunch of her boots in the dirt beside him. He slowed his pace. She slowed too. He stopped completely. She stopped as well, head still lowered. "You don't have to follow me," he said quietly. She didn't respond. He studied her more carefully now, beneath the dirt. Her skin looked pale, not sun-darkened like most frontier women. Her hands, though scraped and raw, held a certain delicacy in their shape. Fingers long and precise. When she briefly lifted her eyes for just a second, they appeared dark and alert, not empty or broken. Caleb swallowed hard. "All right then. Come on." The journey back to his ranch took several hours. The road stretched through open country, winter grass brittle underfoot, wind sharp and unforgiving. Caleb expected her to fall behind, to struggle. She didn't. She maintained the horse's pace, breathing steadily, gaze fixed ahead. When the sun dropped low and cold crept in, she wrapped her torn shawl tighter around herself without complaint. By the time the ranch appeared, a small house crouched against distant hills. Caleb's legs ached, his thoughts tangled like barbed wire. He opened the gate, led the horses to corral, then showed her the small bunkhouse set apart from the main building. "You can stay here," he said, gesturing inside. "There's a stove with stacked out back." She stepped in cautiously, eyes moving over the narrow bed, the simple table, the shelf of tools. When she turned back to him, she nodded once. No fear, no gratitude, just acknowledgement. Caleb returned to the main house and came back with bread and a tin of water. He set them on the table. "You're safe here," he said, feeling foolish the moment the words left his mouth. Again, that brief nod. As night settled over the ranch, Caleb lay awake in bed, staring at the dark ceiling. Wind rattled the windows, carrying distant coyote calls. Somewhere outside, a door creaked softly, the bunkhouse maybe, or the barn settling. He wondered what kind of life led a woman to be sold alongside animals, thrown in like broken equipment nobody wanted. He told himself he'd done the right thing. Still, unease pressed against his ribs, heavy and insistent. He'd brought trouble home with him. He felt certain of it. Trouble and something else he couldn't yet name. Outside in the bunkhouse, the woman sat awake as well, hands folded neatly in her lap, listening to the unfamiliar quiet. Her eyes remained sharp in the darkness, mind turning and measuring. She wasn't as helpless as the auction yard believed. And before dawn touched the hills, both of them sensed that yesterday's events had set something irreversible in motion, something that would leave neither of them unchanged. Morning arrived brittle and pale, the kind of dawn that crept over the hills without offering warmth. Frost covered the ground, crunching under Caleb's boots as he crossed the yard carrying a bucket. He worked automatically, feeding the horses, checking the water trough, trying not to think about the woman sleeping in the bunkhouse. Trouble had a way of growing teeth if you stared at it too long. He was fixing a loose board on the corral when he heard it. A voice, not a whisper or cry, but clear, measured speech drifting from the house, carried by thin morning air. If you brace it first, it won't pull loose again. Caleb froze, hammer suspended in midair. His heart pounded once, hard. He listened again, holding his breath, The voice continued calmly. Now it will last. It was a woman's voice, educated, certain. Slowly, Caleb set down the hammer and walked toward the house, each step deliberate, as if the sound might vanish if he moved too quickly. The door stood slightly open. Inside, the stove crackled softly. The woman from the auction stood at the table. Sleeves rolled past her elbows, dark hair pulled back loosely with a strip of cloth. A cupboard door lay open before her, its hinge newly straightened by careful hands. She looked up when she sensed him in the doorway. Their eyes met. "You speak," Caleb said, the words escaping before he could shape them properly. "Yes," she replied simply. The straightforwardness of it struck him harder than denial would have. Her voice carried no shame, no challenge, just truth. "You didn't yesterday," he said. She wiped her hands on her skirt. "I didn't speak there. Silence keeps men careless." Caleb leaned against the doorframe, his thoughts scrambling to catch up. "They said you couldn't speak." "They were wrong," she said gently. He watched her more closely now, the way she stood straight-backed and composed, the way her gaze didn't dart or fall. This wasn't a broken woman pulled from the world's edges. This was someone who'd learned restraint the way others learn violence. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated only briefly, then lifted her chin. "Eleanor Whitfield." The name fell into the room like a stone into deep water. Caleb felt the echo immediately. Whitfield. He'd seen it printed in newspapers tacked to saloon walls. Railroad interests, judges who owed favors, land disputes that always ended the same way. And months back, a different headline, smaller and quieter, easy to miss. Whitfield daughter missing, presumed dead, reward offered. Then quietly withdrawn. He stared at her. That's a dangerous name to carry. "I know," Eleanor said. "It nearly killed me." She turned back to the cupboard hinge, tightening it with steady hands. "I was sent west to be married, a business arrangement I refused. When I learned what my family was doing, how they took land, how they silenced those who objected, I made copies of letters, contracts, proof." Caleb's jaw tightened. "And they sold you." "They erased me," she corrected. "Selling me was easier than killing me. No blood, no questions." Cold settled into his chest. He thought of the chains at the auction, the laughter. "They'll come looking." "Yes." Eleanor met his eyes again. "And when they do, I won't blame you for sending me away." The words were measured, prepared. She clearly rehearsed them before. Caleb shook his head slowly. "You don't decide that alone." The days that followed felt tight with unease. Riders passed the ridge more than once, distant silhouettes against the sky. Eleanor worked without being asked, mending, cooking, cleaning, moving with quiet efficiency. She never overstepped, never waited for permission either. In the evening, she sat at the table with Caleb's ledger spread out, frowning thoughtfully. "You're being underpaid for beef," she said one night, tapping the column with her finger. "And the rail spur you're using, they're charging you for land they don't own." Caleb blinked. "How do you know that?" "I've seen the original surveys," she said. "Your water line, too. It crosses public ground before reaching your creek. They can't claim it." He stared at her, realization dawning. "That's why my father lost the south pasture." "Yes." Anger burned in his gut, hot and old. Eleanor showed him how to redraw his claims, how to file complaints that couldn't be ignored. The ranch began to breathe again slowly, like a man waking from illness. And then the men came. They rode in just before sunset, badges polished, smiles practiced. 3 of them. The lead man dismounted with confidence. Boots clean, eyes sharp. "We're looking for a woman," he said easily, believed to be dangerous. Caleb stepped onto the porch, rifle resting casually against his shoulder. Lots of women in the territory. The man smiled wider. "This one answers to Whitfield." Eleanor stepped out beside Caleb, papers in her hands. "My name is Eleanor Whitfield," she said. "And you're trespassing." The men stiffened. The leader's eyes flicked to the document she held. "You're supposed to be dead." "I was supposed to be silent," Eleanor replied. Neither worked out. She handed the papers to Caleb, who passed them down without a word. The men read, color draining from their faces. "These letters," Eleanor continued, "implicate my father and several associates in fraud, coercion, and unlawful seizure of land. Copies have already been sent east." It was a lie, half of one anyway. But the men didn't know that. The leader swallowed hard. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly," Eleanor said. "Leave now." They mounted without another word, riding hard as dusk swallowed them. When the sound of hooves faded, Caleb released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Eleanor said softly. That night they sat on the porch steps, stars sharp and endless overhead. The land lay quiet, holding its breath. "You didn't have to stay," Eleanor said after a while. Caleb looked at her, really looked at the strength she carried without display, at the fire she'd learned to bank, not extinguish. "I wasn't about to hand you back to men who think people come with price tags." She smiled then, small and real. For the first time since the auction, Caleb felt the unease lift, replaced by something steadier. Purpose, partnership. She leaned closer. No chains, no shadows between them now. And Caleb knew with absolute certainty that the secret he'd brought home from the auction yard hadn't ruined his life as he'd feared. It had saved it.